Hello, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on using AI governance to safely scale AI with speed. So the facilitator for this workshop is Sophie Dionnet. Welcome, Sophie. I'm Harish Tumbala. I'm moderator for this workshop. Just before we begin, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment them in the chat. I'll give you a quick example on how you could send a quick question so that the facilitator could answer it while she's giving the presentation. And lastly, if you guys haven't purchased a summit ticket and are planning to join the talks tomorrow and the day after, please look out for the email from Hopin in your inbox, maybe today evening or by early tomorrow morning. Okay, let me quickly introduce Sophie. So Sophie is the general manager at Dataiku Business Solutions team. She's focused on developing industry-specific offerings as well as offerings related to AI governance. Sophie joined Dataiku in 2019 after 14 years in the financial industry, where she was COO of multi-asset management units at leading asset management firms. Sophie draws on extensive experience in strategic business leadership, management of complex transformation projects, and development of new businesses, particularly in responsible investment. Okay, I'll let Sophie take the lead, and it's all you, Sophie.
Thanks a lot, and hi everyone. I'm very happy to have a chance to speak to you. So, as mentioned, I've been at Dataiku for a little bit above 2 years now. The team that I'm leading notably actively focuses on all the challenges linked to the governance of AI, because we see that topic, first of all, strongly growing, but also being extremely instrumental to sound and safe scaling of AI. And this is really what we're going to be deep diving into today. So feel free to put all the questions that you have gradually in the chat. I'm going to be sharing some slides. Happy to and to deep dive in some questions that have been very interesting for you. So let me share my slides. So I've changed a little bit the title because ultimately we see the topic of governance growing. As you will see, it's tightly linked, at least part of it is linked to the fact that there's regulation emerging. And so one of the questions that can be asked is whether this is an opportunity or this is a risk. Well, we know that AI is clearly not universally accepted still. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is focusing first on why governing AI governance is the new must-do, and what are the different drivers pushing this trend. Second, we're actually going to be focusing on how do we define AI governance. We work with about 400 customers, and every time we have these discussions, I think every single person that we discuss with, each projects on that notion of AI governance their own specific definition linked to the own risks or their own needs that they're trying to address. So we'll try to have a definition, or at least I will share with you how at Dataiku we try to approach this. Then I'll feedback a little bit what we're learning from the ground and on what we're seeing on our side around how can you build the right AI governance. This notion of right doesn't mean anything. It's more the appropriate AI governance. There's no one size fits all. There's nothing universal. I will certainly not claim to have any universal truth, but based on the different things that we're seeing, we will be happy to share back some of these best practices. And then I'll wrap things up to explain to you what are some of our convictions behind and how it materializes through Dataiku. So I hope everyone is comfortable with this agenda. And with this being said, let's dig in. So I'm going to start by talking about something which is not AI at all, just to set the scene. When there are new trends arriving, when there are new topics emerging, when there are new innovations happening, The most important thing initially is actually to make things happen. So if you look at airplanes and the creation of them, when in 1903, the Wright brothers made their first airplane fly, they were really not focused on knowing where it was going to land, at what time it was going to take off, how exactly it could manage to connect from one area to another. What they wanted to make sure was that actually the airplane would fly. They wanted to make innovation happen. They wanted to make change. They wanted to make that type of impact. And this is all right. It makes perfect sense. But as we all know, there was a full democratization after that of airplanes. And pre-COVID, there were above 100,000 flights per day in the sky. I actually like the image on the left-hand side. It's a Photoshop building that has been done with photos being taken 8 hours in a row at the exact same time over one day. And you can see the number of planes that actually arrive and land in that specific airport. The consequence of all this is that if you take those 100,000 flights that were happening every single day before COVID, you can't let it happen without any form of organization and governance. You need certain rules, you need certain principles. Who takes off? Why do they take off first? What happens if there's a crash? Who's allowed to do certain types of things, et cetera, et cetera. And so the notion, let's say, of governance, the establishment of a watchtower really starts to grow as airplane democratization started to happen. And so as you will see, it's exactly the same thing as what we're seeing right now with analytics and AI. In order to represent the curve of maturity of AI, we like to use that curve here, which is to say that most of the time, as for any other innovation, you usually go through a number of different steps. First, you explore and you look at what that innovation can be about. Second, you experiment. You try to make an impact. You try to see how it can support you on your key topics. Then you establish a practice and you start using it in a bit more of an intentional manner. Let's take back my example with airplanes. You start telling yourself, okay, I know how to fly a plane, then I'm actually gonna try to have a regular between Paris and New York, for instance. And then you expand, you start making it a little bit more systematic. And you also start ingraining it in your ways of doing business. And last but not least, you fully embed it in your ways of doing. At that stage, usually it means that the topic has become quite plain vanilla. So same as using a computer today is completely plain vanilla, but it really wasn't the case 20, 30 years back, or more 30 years back. Where we stand today with analytics is more or less in that zone. Most organizations that we see, most of our customers on our side, are completely past this experimentation stage. Many of them are in the establishment phase. They know they have done AI, they know what can be the benefits, they are putting in place the right foundations in order to scale, and they're expanding. And all of them are trying to go back, which also coincides with the moment where we see the notion of governance emerging. Exactly at that point. Why shouldn't it happen earlier? Because if it were to happen earlier, if people were to be hyper-focused on governing before making things happen, in that case, it would actually be a blocker. You need first to make innovation happen. You need first to show and demonstrate the impact, and then you can start asking yourselves the questions around scaling. But as we see a lot of the market maturing in this direction, so does the need for governance emerging. I'm going to pause there just to see if there are any questions so far, or if everyone's aligned, I will gently move on. So with no questions in the chat, I will assume that everyone's on board and that we can move on from there. So this notion of governance is actually pushed by 4 different drivers. One first driver that we're going to spend a little bit of time investigating into is the fact that there's a growing development of AI-focused guidelines and regulations worldwide. Second topic is that within the organizations themselves, more and more are concerned or focused on how AI could have a positive or negative impact on their brands, and want to make sure that everything that they do when it comes to analytics, when it comes to AI, fully align with their values and their brand positioning. Third dimension is governance is just not a question of blocking only, it's also a question of efficiency. Having the right type of governance means maximizing your focus and your impact. And similarly, as we are past this experimentation stage, more and more organizations want to make the most of their investments, which can be quite significant, and as a consequence, are focused on this part of efficiency. Last but not least, there's a question of, if I leave experimentation, I actually want to embed and integrate, which again means that you are democratizing access, you're opening the access much more broadly than to your initial early adopters, which comes with a number of different risks and a number of different needs. And in order to organize this in the right approach, having the right type of governance is also much needed. So I'm going to be focusing on each of these 4 pillars, and we'll start initially by the first bit, which is around regulation. Welcome to a very, very packed slide. And I will certainly not try to ask you to read through all of this. But what it nicely represents is that even if the EU is today at the forefront of the debate with the AI Act that has been recently released, many other similar initiatives are in progress. Today, only 2 countries are really targeting the real regulatory space. These are Europe and Canada. But we also see similar trends happening in the UK. We also see the US looking at how they can do things either at federal agency levels or through guidelines. We see Australia issuing some guidelines that are going in similar directions as the other ones. And Singapore historically had been at the forefront of issuing a very comprehensive set of guidelines in order to support different organizations. I will deep dive into a little bit what Europe is doing and what Canada is doing. And after that, we'll just make a wrap up of what are the learnings on this. On Canada's side, what we see is that there are 2 different plays, one specifically in Quebec, one generally speaking in Canada. And if I was attempting to summarize, I would say that it's both a catch up on GDPR and a strong focus on putting AI and ML under control. There's a big component in there around data protection and data management. And at the same time, also the ambition of stating some roles and responsibilities when it comes to delivery of AI, and also trying to outline what are the wrongs and what are the rights, and what could be the liabilities in case of defaults in that space. These are 2 projects yet. None of this is being enforced, but it showcases how one country can go in the direction of actually putting in place a comprehensive framework in order to tackle data privacy issues and AI-related ones. What Canada is trying to do is, in fact, quite aligned with what EU is aiming for, which is to set out a pyramid of risks when it comes to identification of risks linked to AI. The EU pyramid, which you're seeing out there, and which has been issued a few months ago, defines 4 different buckets of risks between unacceptable, which are banned, except for in very, very highly specific situations, high risk, the yellow zone, which will be one quite interesting to deep dive into, and a green and a blue bucket where there will be less needs of enforcement, but an encouragement from all organizations to have certain principles whenever developing AI. The learnings of all this is that for all organizations which today, so as for the Canada regulation, this is not enforced at the moment. It is still a project. It has been submitted. There are back and forth happening. The ideal state would be that some enforcements would start to be happening middle of next year with a gradual transition period. But even if this is still at a state of project, same as for Canada, it is showcasing how governments are going to be embracing what AI is, the fact that it can have specific risks attached to it, and the fact that they want to put in place a framework in order to support organizations in defining proper ways of building things. On the EU side, practically what it's going to mean is that any single organization, what that is EU-based, so it can be a EU company or it can be just a company that is active in the European Union, will have to know what are their models, and how to rate them versus that pyramid. Everything that will fall in the yellow bucket, the high risk zone, which, give or take, touches fundamental rights of citizens. That's one of the key areas of focus of those regulations. Will need to have certain types of risk mitigation strategies being put in place and some reporting. As you will see there, all these different steps will be key and essential to be followed by any organization as this regulation comes into play. Sorry, I had an interruption behind me. Apologies for this. What will be the risk linked to it? Any organization that would be exposed to having activities in the red bucket would be exposed to certain types of fines. Anyone exposed to the orangey bucket will be exposed to other types of fines that are less limited, but there are also all the other consequences, such as reputational, operational, and financial risks. I will pause that. Do you have any questions on all this? Okay, no questions or remarks. I will move on. If we take a big step back, even if the formats are very different from one country to another, the requirements and the focus remain the same. What all these guidelines and all these regulations are aiming to do is to put some framework in place that will guarantee sustainability and control of AI initiatives. First things first is an identification of models. What all these regulators want is for any organization that does AI to know where their models are and what are they supposed to do. And as you will probably know from your own organizations, identifying models is far from being a given. They can happen in many different areas. Sometimes they're purchased from third-party vendors. So having a way of having a robust catalog of all this will be a first. Second is these regulations focus on having these models identified, owned, and documented. It's not just a question of knowing where they are, but also of who owns them and what are they supposed to be applied for. There's a big question transversally on framework robustness, having the right type of IT setup, guaranteeing that there can't be any cybersecurity or intrusion risks. And last but not least, all of these usually focus on protecting end customers. We know that with AI comes a number of different risks. They can be linked to bias. They can be linked to black box. So focusing on bias mitigation and explainability are completely core to what these regulations are trying to do. And I would add to this, which is not necessarily represented on this slide, that ultimately they also focus on protecting the rights of end customers. I didn't touch too much about this, but the yellow bucket is concerns in the EU part, concerns everything that is connected to the individual rights of end citizens. Things around, for instance, equality of access to energy, equality of access to transportation, equality of treatment in recruitment processes. Anything that would be linked to HR and that can have some biases consequences will be tagged in the yellowy bucket. So, which, as you will easily see, can concern pretty much any form of organization. So loans applications, for instance, would also fall in that yellow bucket because we all know what can be the consequences of poorly managed loans application models. So as you will see, the scope of application is going to be quite broad with the intention of the regulator to protect end individuals. So long story short, this is really one of the first key drivers that is pushing the emergence of this topic of governance. The second one, which is completely connected to this and that I'm not going to spend too much time on, is the fact that the usage of AI, the usage of analytics triggers certain types of risks for a company's brand. What we hear more and more from our customers is the need for them to ensure that everything that is happening in their AI analytic initiatives is completely aligned with their values and how their companies want to position themselves. It's notably something that we hear a lot from telco companies. Financial services tend to react a lot to regulation. there's a real muscle flexed here. All financial services space is very used to managing new regulatory compliance. Telco, among telco players, there are those who can make a business out of their data, and there are some who position themselves as not wanting to invest too much in that space, which, as you will see, creates a different, let's say, in positioning. And what they usually end up doing is wanting to have their underlying AI analytics initiatives completely aligned with these core values. So this part here is very important in all this, and is also a very big driver of pushing for that acceleration of governance. Three additional topics, and then we'll deep dive into what an applied governance can look like. As I said before, so governance can be a pretty scary topic, and it can be a topic that is seen as a blocker. But it's not the only motivation why certain organizations decide to invest in building strong governance for their analytics initiative. One can be simply also that they want to maximize the efficiency and their impact of their initiatives. As you see here, one of the things usually that you try to do when you build an analytics initiatives is not only to have a collection of use cases, but to have a cross-pollination of your different use cases. You want to have focus on your highest impact initiatives. You want to accelerate your time to impact. You want to make sure that the value chain between the initial ideation down to put in production, including validation of your documentation, happens the most quickly possible, in the most quickly possible way. And last but not least is, as different activities, analytics initiatives scale, many are supported by what we would call self-service analytics initiatives or citizen data scientist programs. Opening extremely largely access to data, opening very largely the possibility to transform data and turn it into something else comes here again with certain types of risks. And so managing them, making sure there's a full understanding of what is happening on the ground in order not to have ex post risk mitigation to manage is quite important to the success. Last thing is, we talked about it, we're past experimentation stage. We're down into business integration. And so in order to deliver the potential of AI across business lines, it demands having the right type of framework, notably to build the right type of trust across all stakeholders. Some of your business lines are going to be consumers of AI. Let's take HR professionals. HR professionals, most of them are not going to turn themselves into data scientists, but they could use AI on a day-to-day basis. They need to have trust that what this AI is doing is aligned with their needs. So the focus on explainability, on controls, but also on empowerment in these individuals, in understanding what they have access to, how to apply it, what are the rights and the wrongs is also very important, which is something that sound governance, integrating all these different stakeholders, can help tackle. So this is what I wanted to cover as an introduction. Are there any questions on all this before I deep dive into the learnings so far? Okay, I hope everyone is enjoying the talk, and I will move on to my second part. I unfortunately don't have an opportunity to do a poll, but if I had, I'm quite sure that some of these words would have popped up when in an attempt to define what AI governance is. We usually see a sample of these words coming out, which can range from topics linked to the initial development of AI, the validation of AI, the operationalization of AI, the ex post controls, the documentations, et cetera, et cetera. On our side, what we try to do is we actually like to represent AI governance as being a wrap-up of three different notions. AI governance is itself covering two other dimensions. MLOps, which is the red bucket that is here, which, as you all know, is the process of taking one project from step A to step B being full operationalization. It usually demands for a number of different people to be involved, and streamlining that value chain, making sure that roles and responsibilities are very well understood is actually extremely critical. The second bit that is completely interconnected is that it's not just a question of taking a project from step A and going to step B, but also of making sure that the projects themselves are completely aligned with the intentions of your organization. So let's take back one of the examples that I was giving before. Let's take a loans model, for instance. That loans model, so to answer the numerous questions in the Slack, yes, you will get, I'm not completely sure about the slides. I will let the organizer of the event answer. But on my side, if you contact us after that, it will be just fine to share the slides to the presentation. As I was saying before, on the responsible AI side, when you think about it, you can have a model that is being perfectly operationalized, that goes from step A to step B, but that is an absolute threat to an organization, whether it's willing or unwilling. And so making sure that the right type of people are integrated in guaranteeing that a model is aligned with intentions. It's actually intentional AI is usually a word I like better than responsible AI. It's not a question around judging what is right and wrong. It's more a question of ensuring that what has been delivered is aligned with what is needed or what is expected. These, as you can see, are a strong and integrated value chain. You bundle all this together and you want to do it at scale. And there comes the notion of AI governance. How do you operationalize it inside your own organization? How do you make sure that all these people that need to work together, data scientists, business leaders, business users, work tightly together with central teams who usually represent a mix of analytics leaders, IT folks, risk managers in bundling all this together? Any questions on these notions and why we tie these three different notions together? Okay, so moving on. We've been discussing AI governance topics with our customers for quite a while now, notably because we have ourselves worked quite a bit on the notion, and you will have understood that we consider the notion as being extremely important to safe AI scaling. And what we see is that there's no rights and wrongs in creating that environment, but there can be a number of steps that make a lot of sense when trying to put it in place. First things first, it is extremely difficult to put in place an AI governance without having a vision on principles and responsibilities. Companies need to know what they want to do and what they don't want to do. Let's go back to my loans example. In a company, in a banking organization, there's an acceptance to certain levels of risks. It can be quite different from an organization to another. In an insurance company, they can be the decision to insure certain types of population and not certain others. I can have ethical convictions around this, but ultimately, at least for these organizations, having a vision of what they want to do and not do is extremely important. We're a software vendor. We work with all industries, which again could trigger some questions for some. Having this vision, this AI corporate policy, having a clear view of who's doing what. For those of you who might come from financial services, you must be very used to these types of level 1, level 2, level 3 pyramids. Level 1s are those who are doing, level 2 do systematic or controls, level 3s are usually internal audit teams. Knowing who's doing what is extremely important as an initial starting point. No process can be enforced without this. And as a result of this, no tools can be implemented to support. The second step is usually you have a decision to make at some point, which is AI is specific. It has specific risks. We talked about biases. We talked about explainability. We haven't talked about model drift, but we could have talked about it. We haven't talked about data drift, but same thing, we could have talked about it. Do I build a specific governance in or specific set of committees in order to support this, or do I embed this into my traditional ways of doing? What usually we see with the organizations around us is that AI tends to be approached as being a standalone initiative initially with its own governance, and then gently gets back and embedded in the rest of the organization. And it's probably a very natural process. I believe it would be hard for it to be started as being something that is completely embedded, because it would probably not have the right type of bandwidth. And there's a level of education and enablement that is needed in order to get to the right stage. The third topic is that for all organizations, there's a need of looking at what are all these different risks and what are the risks that are most material and need to be tackled. For some industries have industry-specific requirements. Financial services need to have model risk management. And with model risk management comes the need to have very specific reviews being done for certain types of models. Compliance risk is another one. We've seen that there's a regulation coming up. GDPR has changed significantly how data can be approached, at least in the EU. We see that Canada is on the road of having a regulation that touches both data, but also ML or AI. So embracing this, especially in organizations that are global and that have a footprint in many different geographies is very important. Responsible AI. Not all models expose to the same types of risk. A model that is here to tier operational alerts between their levels of likelihood of operational failure clearly do not have the same implications as a model helping to do risk assessment on levels of health risk in health institutions. So depending upon the types of models, this type of AI applications, having more or less scrutiny on the outputs in order to protect the organization and also making sure, once again, that the output of AI is aligned with intentions is very important. Last but not least, there's also a space that we see emerging. Sustainability is on the growth for very valid reasons. Climate change is a real threat. And as a consequence of this, we see more and more sustainability and the need to ensure alignment between AI and sustainability growing up. It's also a dimension that we see in some of the regulations that I've mentioned before. One of the questions that I see in the chat is, have we seen AI governance integrated with data governance? I would say yes and no, to be honest. I think data governance is a foundation layer that absolutely needs to be there for analytics and AI to emerge and to be operated in the right way. But managing model governance is not exactly the same type of need that is managing data governance. Data governance, you will usually have notions of lineage, stewards, quality, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very foundational to making sure that AI governance is properly managed. But AI comes with its own, let's say, set of risks and requirements. And so usually they're quite linked, but still tackled by different types of teams in the organizations that we talk to. So let's say that you've had your principles and responsibilities, you know what type of framework that you want to put in place. You have your views on the risks that you want to address. And now you have set up all this, you have policies, you have documents, you have controls, and you want to make sure that people actually apply them. I just wanted to share the anecdote that we had from one of our customers. He had approached, that person had approached the whole matter with a stick and carrot approach that I find quite interesting. A data scientist who complied with internal processes, meaning that he had filled documentations, he had qualified his projects properly, had a carrot, access to data in 3 days. Someone that didn't, usually it took 3 weeks. You could consider that this is fair or not, but it's the type of positive reinforcements that can be put in place in order to maximize enforcement and adoption of these principles. Last but not least, and this is a topic that is very dear to my heart as a Dataiku representative, we trust in collaboration. We trust that none of these topics are the responsibility of one person in an isolated manner. AI will continue to be built by data scientists, sometimes by business folks, but actually having a data scientist in the loops makes sense because let's face it, not everyone's going to become a data scientist overnight. I work with data scientists on a day-to-day basis. I really can't do their job. But what I can do is I can bring them a business eye. And what an IT person can do, what my lead director engineer can do, he can bring me an engineer eye, which is very, very different. What a risk person can do is he can bring me the right checklist telling me, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? what we believe very strongly is that making AI governed, safely scaling with AI, is a question of making all these people actually work together in a seamless manner throughout the entire value chain. There's one point in time where we believe that this is all the more so important. It's there. It's at this second stage, the qualification stage. It's really at that moment when you tell yourself what's feasible, what's not feasible, what are the risks, what are the value, etc. Some of you might be surprised actually, because we put it as step number 2. We don't put it as step number 1, which is more the traditional thing. My experience of working with data scientists is that in many cases, we're not completely sure of what could be the use cases of the topics before we give it a shot. And so it makes sense to also have a safe sandbox space where people can try and test. And it's by doing so that you certainly are able to scope a topic and then tell yourself, that's possible, not possible. Oh my God, this can have certain types of risk. Ooh, that could be really good in terms of value and impact. Which is part of our advice and recommendation could be to have it as this 2-stage process. The rest is relatively straightforward. But as you can imagine, all these different types of stakeholders that I showed before actually all have a key role to play in that value chain. So I'm almost done with my speech. I hope it was interesting. Just wanted to share with you some of how it materializes on our side. For some of you who don't know Dataiku, we're focused on the delivery of a platform that is here to enable any organization inject the data that they need in order to transform it into the right type of data product, analytics, or AI to have the right type of impact of their organization. Which means that we're building an environment to enable all the different types of profiles that we talked about before to collaborate in a seamless manner, and more importantly, I would say in a very transparent manner. Governance has been very foundational to what Dataiku is about. And one of the outputs of this is to make sure that people who have more of a clicker profile, those who have a coding profile, can work all together in a seamless manner. We've also really enriched what you can consider as being this workbench with very advanced capabilities on the explainability front in order to streamline and facilitate this discussion. Last but not least, one of the virtues of Dataiku is taking you through the whole process from actual ideation into full operationalization with the full MLOps on the entire scope of projects that are either developed on Dataiku or integrated into Dataiku. And as you can see, we have really structured our platform along these different dimensions. One is focused on efficiency. How do I make sure that I can search and easily reuse? How can I package bits and pieces of codes that are interesting? How can I easily create plugins, et cetera, et cetera? How can I monitor all this through model registry, through sign-off, through model and data drift, through versioning, through scenarios and deployment health monitoring? How can I be intentional? How can I be responsible in how I develop AI through qualification, explainability, fairness metrics, interactive scoring? And last but not least, how do I make sure that all of this is auditable with document storage, versioning, document generator, and so on? So as a wrap up, you have understood what I wanted to get to. AI governance is absolutely key to safe AI scaling. That's a real conviction on my side. And I can tell you from all the discussions we've been having over the past year and a half, we see the topic really maturing. The EU regulation has been a good kick, to be honest, everywhere, not just in Europe. But beyond that, this need to go beyond the simple fact that people go from 20, 30, 40 practitioners to 200s or 400, 2000s absolutely makes critical the fact that governance needs to be enforced. We see all these different trends, regulation, focusing on robustness, controls, explainability. There's no rights and wrong. All organizations are going to have to invent their secret sauce, combining different types of dimensions. But what we would see as being completely core to this is that having a way of knowing where models are, by whom they're done, facilitating collaboration, making sure that all these different viewpoints can easily talk to each other will be paramount in being successful in this space. I will stop there. I see that there's one question in the chat that I'm just going to take 2 minutes to read and try to answer. And if there's any other questions, don't hesitate to post them. So have we seen enterprise companies approach these problems, building their own tunes and others? I think the field is still relatively at early stages. We see requests that are focusing a little bit more heavily on the MLOps side. From a relationship with partners, we know that the topic is emerging. A bunch of the partners we're working with are having more and more requests for audits. I think as the whole topic matures, the need to have proper organization framework and implementation is gonna rise accordingly. Hope this helps. This was for Zachary. Anything else to be discussed before we close the workshop? Okay, I hope this was interesting.
All right. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for sharing your expertise on AI governance and how we'll be looking at in the future. And thank you all for joining today for this workshop. You have a wonderful rest of TMLS. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.